Hey everybody, so in this week's Daf Yomi, one of the things that is being discussed is who authored various books of the Tanakh. Not the 5 books of Moses, the first part, the Torah. That, according to Jewish tradition, is Moshe, dictated by God to Moshe, but the other books, Joshua, Judges, etc., etc. And then they get into the discussion about the book of Job. Who authored the book of Job? And it tells us, according to Jewish tradition, that Moshe was the author. Now, the book of Job, in case you're not familiar, deals with the age-old question of why bad things happen to good people. It's a story, it's a little bit troubling actually, where God has this discussion with the Satan, the Satan, which is a bit of a corrupted idea thanks to Christianity. It's not an independent power of God. God created it, but still God has this discussion with Satan, and Satan challenges God and says, Job, you think he's so righteous, give him a lot of suffering, and let's see how righteous he remains, and if he won't just curse you to your face, so to speak. And so that's what happens. He goes, there's all these tests and trials and horrible things that happen. He loses his family, he loses his business, he loses everything, all kinds of difficulties, physical difficulties and such. And then he has these 3 friends who discuss with him why this is happening to him. And so it really gets into this whole issue of pain and suffering and a loving God and an all-knowing God and an all-powerful God. But then the Gemara goes into, so when exactly did this fellow Job live? And so it gives a bunch of opinions, and it's very, very unique because you don't have this with any other biblical figure in the whole Tanakh. And it starts off by telling us that Job lived in the time of the Meraglim, the spies, which we just read about, which is basically Moshe's time during the travels in the desert. And then Rav Yochanan and Rav Elazar, they say that he was amongst those who came up from the Babylonian exile in the time of Ezra. That's like way later. That's like 800, 900 years later. That's towards the end of the biblical period. Rav Elazar says, when did Job live? During the time period of the Judges. That's back to kind of early on in the Tanakh. You have Moshe, Joshua, and then after Joshua dies, you have the period of the Judges. Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha says in the time of Achashverosh. Now we're getting back to the end of the biblical period because that's the time period, that's the Purim story. Continues, Rav Nassan says, during the time of the kingdom of Sheba, the queen of Sheba, the time of Solomon. Oh, back to earlier biblical period. And then we have another opinion that says that Job lived in the time of Jacob. Now we're really going back, pre-Moshe. He's all over the place, according to these various different opinions. And they're all based on similar wording between the book of Job and in these other areas. Then there's also a discussion, was Job Jewish or not Jewish? Not sure about that one. And then there's even opinion that says there was no such thing as a guy named Job. Eov never existed. The whole book is allegory. What's the point over here? Because again, it's like so different. It's so strange based on every other biblical figure where we can place them in a particular time period. This Job fellow is all over the place if he exists at all. And so I would suggest that the point here is that the theme of the book represents this discussion, namely, why bad things happen to good people, an all-knowing and all-loving God, and pain and suffering, and trying to understand that. Yeah, everybody has that question, no matter what period you live in, whether you live in the time period of Jacob, Moses, later, here, Jewish, Gentile, anybody who takes God seriously has that question. Moshe himself asked of God, Hareini na derachecha, show me your ways. And according to Jewish tradition, what was he asking? He wanted to understand God's system of reward and punishment in this world. Even he was scratching his head about that. Even he was bothered by that. And so that's the point I would suggest that's getting across over here. I've had people come up to me and say, I don't believe in God because of the Holocaust or because of whatever tragedy, fill in the blank. As if they're the first person to think, you know what? This is their kasha. This is their question on God. I got news for you. Everybody has that question on God. Everyone, including Moshe, has that question of God. But as Dennis Prager one time pointed out, just because you believe in God, you have that theological issue, you have that problem, you have that question, and it's legitimate, understandably. Well, being an atheist doesn't leave you scot-free either. You're going to have a lot of issues and questions as well. No God, no spirituality, no eternity. What are we? We're just a bunch of molecules. There's nothing spiritual. I'm not using this as a proof, but as Rabbi Ackerman way back in the day of Eshet Torah used to say, so if there's no God and no soul and no eternity, no justice and no good and no right and no wrong, because they all go together, those things, so what's the purpose of life? Your maggot meat. Your feed for maggots after 120 years. Oh, but I'll have children. They're maggot meat. Oh, my grandchildren. They're maggot meat. So if you take God out of the picture, you also have a few questions. So again, either belief in God or don't believe in God, we all have issues. And so the big one, once again, expressed in this book of Job, is pain and suffering. The bottom line is it's a legitimate question. It's not to be shied away from. And ultimately, we have emunah, we have belief, we have faith that ultimately everything is for the good. We don't see it all the time, and you certainly don't say that to somebody going through suffering, but ultimately, that's all we can rely on, because this question is just beyond the understanding of anyone and everyone, including Moshe. Have a good Shabbat.